Chapter 2: The Antisocial Family. 1. Inheritance. Almost all of us are born and reared in a family. Those who are not raised by their parents in a private household are brought up in institutions that seek to imitate family life as faithfully as possible. What could be more classless than this universal experience? What could be less divisive? In reality, far from being a social leveler, forging bonds that cut across the barriers of class and sex, the family creates and recreates the very divisions it is often thought to ameliorate. The family is a class institution and gives us each our initial class position. Each child begins life in the working class or the property owning class, in the ranks of the professions or of small business, of the landed aristocracy, or of the lowest group of the insecure and unemployed. Most boys will live out their lives in the same class and even in the same section of it. Most girls will marry a man in a situation very similar to their own father's. The main way in which social classes reproduce themselves over time is by bearing and rearing children. This is why Engels associated the historical origin of the modern monogamous family, in which a woman has only one husband, with the origin of private property and class. Quote, "The rule of the man in the family, the procreation of children who could only be his, destined to be the heirs of his wealth, these alone were frankly avowed by the Greeks as the exclusive aims of monogamy." Unquote. There have sometimes been classes and social groups that were reproduced by recruitment rather than by birth. The celibate clergy of the Catholic world, slaves in the Americas while the capturing of slaves in Africa continued, immigrant workers in many parts of Western Europe where settlement is discouraged. Such classes and groups are exceptionally weak and powerless. Even the Catholic Church was weaker than its vast wealth and tenacious ideological grip would have enabled it to be. Indeed, it can be argued that in the heyday of the Church, priestly celibacy was enjoined precisely in order to maintain the access of the great secular families to its highest offices, and so to retain the Church as a whole in a position of client. Slave groups and ethnic minorities that reproduce themselves, though exploited and downtrodden, are at least able to develop some forms of accommodation and adaptation over generations. So inheritance of class position serves to establish and to domesticate class divisions. Of course, people's class position is not fixed by their parentage. Some may move from one class to another, and many move up and down the ladder of status and security within the working class and into the ambiguous positions of bureaucrats, account clerks, scientists, managers. In fact, the expansion of these last categories during the 20th century was achieved largely by recruitment from below and required a large amount of upward mobility. The expansion is now slowing down, and it seems unlikely that such rates of mobility will be seen again. But the experience of social fluidity, the apparent breaking of old class destinies, personified in the career of the grammar school boy and the success of the working man's son at a red brick university, has left its mark in popular consciousness. Education has become seen as the main road to success in life. It is what you do rather than where you are that counts. What is deceptive about the social imagery is that it is too strongly colored by the exceptions, those who move, and it ignores what can be taken for granted, that most men follow their fathers. A recent large-scale survey found that 62% of the sons of men who worked as professionals, administrators, managers, supervisors, and higher grade technicians, class 1 and 2 occupations, were in jobs in the same range as their fathers at the time of the study, and only 13% had manual jobs. At the other end of the scale, 58% of the sons of men in manual jobs themselves had manual jobs, and only 18% had class 1 and 2 jobs. This was the measure of the extent to which fathers passed on social position to their sons during a period when expansion at the top of the job hierarchy was producing new opportunities. How much more will they do so as those who have made it to the top strive to pass on their advantage to their sons? It is interesting that families are less effective in passing the father's occupational status onto their daughters. Unfortunately, there's no evidence about how much women follow in their mother's footsteps. Women often marry up or down. Quote, the typical father from class 1 is more likely to see his daughter downwardly mobile than his son, or to be more precise, to have a son-in-law of lower social class than his son. Conversely, the girl from classes 6 or 8 is more likely to be upwardly mobile than her brother, unquote. And a woman's own occupation is less determined by her father's than a man. The only exception to this is that it is even more difficult for a woman whose father was not a professional or a manager to become one herself than it is for a man. Figures like these give a very gross picture of how social classes are reproduced through the family. They do not tell us much about the processes involved. Perhaps the most important process is the way in which families pass on advantage and disadvantage in the chances of educational success. During the 1950s and 60s, the question of social mobility was a dominant concern among sociologists who studied education. There was socialist concern with equality of opportunity and with showing how the selective system of secondary, modern, and grammar schools failed in its overt objective of offering such opportunity to pupils from working class homes. There were some interesting and depressing findings, which in the end were interpreted to place the credit or blame for school success on the child's home, and especially on the mother. A working class family had to have something unusual about it for its children to do well at school. The mother had to be better educated than average, or the parents interested in reading. What is interesting is how these researches showed that parents affected their children's class position even when they did not simply place them in their own. It is a pity there were not more studies of the way in which parents with professional and managerial jobs so often managed to ensure that their children did not fall too far below them, a task which is becoming increasingly difficult as the expansion of these strata slows down. What is depressing is that the researchers show even more clearly how family and class are interwoven. The sociologists who were involved in these studies shrank from their full implications. They were reluctant to see that their work constituted an indictment of the family as an institution, the more so since they would have been tempted to read it in moralistic and individualistic terms as an indictment of the working class families themselves. The next generation of radical sociologists turned its guns toward a more generally acceptable target and developed a critique of the education system and school curricula from a class perspective. Indeed, it is remarkable how the sociology of the family as a subfield fell from favor as left-wing and critical perspective gained strength within sociology. It is only the advent of the new feminism that has brought it back in. Another major process in reproducing classes is the inheritance of wealth. Quote, it is difficult to avoid the conclusion that inheritance has been the most important single source of wealth inequality in the fairly recent past in 20th century Britain, unquote, according to a study by C.D. Harbury and D.M.W.N. Hitchens. They estimate that something between 2/3 and 4/5 of those who died rich in the third quarter of the present century owed their wealth to inheritance, and the rest to entrepreneurship and luck. Furthermore, daughters who inherit wealth frequently marry sons who inherit wealth. So both inheritance between generations and patterns of marriage among inheritors serve to reproduce the concentration of wealth in a small class of people. We have chosen to start at a very general structural level by showing how the family serves to pass on privilege and disadvantage from one generation to the next. We have done this partly because it highlights very clearly how the family embodies the principle of selfishness, exclusion, and pursuit of private interest and contravenes those of altruism, community, and pursuit of the public good. Society is divided into families, and the divisions are deep, not merely ones of slight antipathy and mild distrust. 2. Individualism equals familism. Conservative thought is often said to focus on the idea of individualism, self-help, self-support, self-sufficiency, self-respect. It rejects dependence, scrounging, collectivism, the belief that the world owes you a living. Yet in practice, the unit of self support is not the individual, but the family. In Britain, no one nowadays thinks that children, as long as they are being trained or educated, should support themselves. Conservatives think that husbands should support their wives and children, and that disabled or old people should be able to turn to their kin for help before they seek help from charity or from the state. Indeed, it has tended to be conservatives who have wished to extend the range of kin among whom mutual aid could be expected, and progressives who have made more and more people eligible for public assistance. This is a boundary that has been contested and shifted many times in the last century and a half. At present, officially speaking, only children under 16 who live with a parent and wives who live with a husband can have no rights to the basic non-insured state social security payments. And still, it is conservatives who resist the socialist demands for an adequate child benefit and reject the feminist demand that husband and wife should have independent rights to social security. Many of the catchphrases of conservative politics, individual choice in education or in healthcare, freedom of choice for consumers, owner occupation, thus mask a defense of paternal as against social responsibility and authority. For it is not children who choose their education, but their parents who, who choose to give them what education they can afford with the father's income. And so it is with health insurance, with housing, and with household consumption. People's standard of living is not determined by their own income, but by that of the household they live in and how its income is shared among its members. In this context, children, and to some extent wives, are mere extensions of men. Their needs are defined for them by the head of the family and as part of his needs. A man should not merely be self-supporting, but should take care of his dependents as well. He should be expected to be able to earn enough to keep a family. Indeed, when a wage is said to be so low that it is below the poverty line, what is meant is that it is below the level of social security benefit for a family of 2 adults and 2 children, not that the worker himself could not live on it. This idea of the family wage for men is deeply embedded in conservative thought. In part, this is because it helps maintain men's privilege and authority, but it is also because the conflation of the individual and the family is absolutely necessary to sustain the conservative economic fantasy. This is a fantasy of an economy in which the actions of self-seeking economic men add up, through the unseen hand of the market mechanism, to an optimal pattern of production and consumption. In it, each member is motivated by self-interest to contribute to the wants of others. In order to elevate the morality of the market into an entire social ethic, it is necessary to ignore all those members of society who do not themselves enter the market. For most of them, this is done by the sleight of hand of subsuming them as members of families into the individuality of their head of household. He can then be assumed to be an economic agent, complete with income, expenditure, consumer preferences, indifference curves, and marginal propensities to all sorts of economic activity. So it becomes possible to believe that the whole economy is organized on the liberal individualist model of the free market, with everyone working in order to support themselves, because those who cannot earn a living are subsumed under those who can. For socialists, it is dangerous to pretend that society is made up entirely of people who can contribute to production. It masks our interdependence and the necessity of a social conception of needs and a social plan for meeting them. Unfortunately, though, there has been a strong tendency in British socialist thought to accept this form of familism. This is largely due to the fact that socialism has been fostered and shaped in a labor movement dominated by the trade unions of the skilled male workers whose own interests lay in privileging those who could, or could claim they could, contribute a great deal to production, and who could use the idea of the family wage to claim higher wages for themselves and to exclude women, children, and young people from the better paid jobs. The idea of being a provider for the family has also become a cherished element of male working class self-esteem. A broader conception of socialism would recognize that this kind of familism merely papers over some of the cracks in the capitalist system or protects those lucky enough to be in the families with a good wage earner. It does not solve the fundamental problems of the wage system as a means of meeting the needs of the working class, that some people have no wage earner to depend on, and some wage earners have no dependents, while others have too many. It is a fantasy solution that would work in reality only if each wage earner had a household of two adults and 2.4 children to support throughout his working life, and the rest of the people were neatly distributed among such households. In other words, it would only work if households were formed on some bureaucratic principle and not as families on the basis of kinship. The confusion of individual and family in conservative thought reflects a close association between the two in everyday life. It is an association that has many pernicious effects. The most marked of these is that children are a private possession. Though they are to join society and be its future members, they are produced by and for their parents. Parents decide how many to have, when to have them, and they try to determine how to bring them up. Often they become extensions of their parents' personalities or a compensation for failings in their lives. They can be a major source of pride or often of disappointment. During childhood, this may be rewarding and apparently successful, but as adolescence wears on and the child becomes more independent, a unique kind of problem frequently occurs. The resentment that parents feel about the wrong choices their children make is quite unlike any disagreement between other people about how to live or what to do. The sort of behavior that provokes a cry of despair, "Why do you treat me like this?" is often not treating the parent at all, but simply choosing the wrong lifestyle, the wrong haircut, the wrong job, the wrong partner. What the children do with their own lives necessarily affects the parents. The biblical notion that when the fathers have eaten a sour grape, the children's teeth are set on edge has little resonance today, but its obverse is part of our daily experience. In this setting of intimate interdependence, it is not surprising that the explanation of individual troubles should be sought in the constellation of the immediate family. Since the 1950s, family therapy rather than individual therapy has been the vogue for dealing with difficult or delinquent children and even to some extent with adults who are mentally ill. In many ways, this is more appropriate than the individualism of traditional therapies, though usually the theory has been that a well organized family with appropriate parental and gender roles would produce adequate personalities and that any problems could be corrected by bringing the family back into line with a good model. R.D. Laing has used a similar vision of family processes to come to the much more disturbing conclusion that in the close knit emotional tangle of the nuclear family nexus, the confusions of intersubjectivity and the problems of distinguishing oneself from the attributions imposed by those closest to one could result in schizophrenia. In the nuclear family, each member attempts to regulate the inner life of the other in order to preserve his own. From Lang's account of the families of his schizophrenic patients, it is not hard to see how the tight intimacy of nuclear family life may cause acute problems for family members, even when the solutions they seek are less dramatic than schizophrenia. Another twist of the screw of familialism and individualism is the way that being reared in an enclosed family with one parent mainly responsible for the children tends to produce a highly individualistic personality structure. Critics of more communal forms of child rearing have argued that a close and continuous bond with a single mother figure during the first few years of life is essential to the development of an adequate personality. John Bowlby describes the consequence of maternal deprivation as an affectionless personality incapable of forming intimate one to one relationships. Renee Spitz argued that infants reared in groups became institutionalized and unable to live as individuals without group support. There have been many doubts about this sort of research. which has mostly looked at residential children's institutions on which the inmates are deprived of considerably more than the mother child bond. But it is often not noticed that even if they were right, the typical personality of the collectively reared child might simply be different, not inadequate. Indeed, the typical personality of the normal successfully family reared child may have its undesirable features, a need to form intimate one-to-one ties to the exclusion of a more diffused bond to a wider group, a tendency to go it alone as an individual, and a lack of concerns for group support and approval or group interests. Bruno Bettelheim in The Children of the Dream has provided a balanced study of communal child rearing in the Israeli kibbutz. He found that the kibbutz reared generation had more uniform educational attainments, with fewer dramatic successes and fewer failures than other Israelis. Quote, the personality of the kibbutz-born generation seems depleted, but these young people seem much less neurotic than their parents, secure within their limitations, though these are often marked. Unquote. The most notable feature, though, is the deep peer attachment that they feel and the intensity of group ties. They function and experience the world better in their group than alone. They are reluctant to contemplate a life apart from each other. Bettelheim says, all these seem to speak more of bondage than attachment. But he concludes, if intense group ties discourage individuation, neither do they breed human isolation, asocial behavior, or other forms of social disorganizations that plague modern man in competitive society. Unquote. We might add that even the successes of the individual child rearing system may be less suited to a truly social life than the products of the kibbutz. Communal societies like the Israeli kibbutzim often discourage an overemphasis on the obligations and attachments of the family. In many kibbutzim, husbands and wives are not allowed to work together, and people are expected to refer to their parents, brothers and sisters, and so on by their names rather than in the terminology of kinship. Similar principles informed many Christian communities in 19th century America. The Oneida community, founded in New York State in 1848, consciously rejected the family and marriage as being inimical to a full communal life. The biblical text, "In heaven they neither marry nor are given in marriage," was taken as justification for complex marriage, in which all the men and women of the community were joined. Heterosexual relations between any of them were encouraged. Long-term pairing was discouraged. Children were cared for in a children's house soon after they were weaned, visiting their own parents only once or twice a week. Their founder, John Humphrey Noyes, saw a very clear contradiction between intense family feelings and community feeling. He believed that the great problem of socialism now is whether the existence of the marital family is compatible with that of the universal family, which the term community signifies. Unquote. The Oneida community adhered to these principles for little longer than 30 years. The kibbutzim too have tended to strengthen family ties and give more time and space to family life as they have moved from the pioneering to a more established phase. In both cases, the shift represents a retreat from socialist ideals, in the kibbutz case partly associated with the complexities of Israeli, Middle Eastern, and world politics. In the Oneida case, the community actually became a joint stock company in 1881, clearly and directly linked to hostile pressures from the locality and legal action against the community initiated by the Presbyterian Church. The fact that such experiments have not endured, or that they have become weakened and diluted, does not detract from the fact that they illustrate vividly how the strengthening of the community enables and requires the weakening of family ties. These ideas were the commonplace of an earlier English tradition of socialist thought. They have sadly faded from view. A vigorous critique of marriage was to be found in the writings of many early feminists. Yet it is often thought that the aspects of marriage they invade against have now disappeared. Marriage is no longer so obviously the main source of livelihood available to bourgeois women, by which they were destined to the housekeeping trade, as Cecily Hamilton put it. The campaigns for easier divorce, supported often by socialists and feminists, have meant that marriage is no longer so indissoluble that people are stuck for life in loveless or brutal bonds. The wedding ceremony itself has been modernized so that women no longer need promise to obey or men to worship. Shorn of its more obviously oppressive features, it is often thought that marriage is now a harmless or neutral institution. Yet this is far from being the case. The new marriage is seen as being both romantic and companionate, an impossible fusion, some would say, certainly a less stable form than the older, overtly male dominated and more prosaic tie. It still produces couples who have a mystic bond whose relationship is accepted as something special and beyond question. They easily slip into living as a social duo, each the better half of the other, each only a half person, and often in a state of hostile dependency, resentful over the failings of a partner who is essential to them. Perhaps all couple relationships have this tendency, but marriage dignifies, privileges, and romanticizes the couple. The marriage relationship becomes protected from criticism so that people are expected to put up with a great deal more from their spouse than they ever would from anyone else. An extreme example is the fact that there is, in the eyes of the law, no such thing as rape in marriage. A woman cannot refuse sex to her husband, though she should to every other man. The other side of the coin is that relationship outside the marriage become thinner and less meaningful. Men frequently have no intimate friends apart from their wife. The partners are expected to be loyal to each other if there is any conflict, so much so that a woman's relationship with her best friend or even a sister may be ruptured if their husbands do not get on. When a marriage breaks up, and it is the essence of the new marriage that it may well do so, the partners often find themselves friendless and isolated. A second marriage, replicating the first, is the easiest solution, and so a pattern of serial monogamy is set up. We have already discussed the appeal of such relationships. They do offer a promise of security and a resolution of many tensions and anxieties. Yet we must ask, if people need a long-term couple relationship, why do they get it sanctified by church, state, and the most backward-looking elements of society? The cynical answer used to be that it was a good way of binding someone to you, though there was an odds-on chance that you would be bound unwillingly to them. The history of the struggle between state and church for control over marriage is not an edifying one, but it can at least teach us that marriage is a contract controlled not by the partners themselves, but by the state. Furthermore, it is an unwritten contract, one whose full implications become apparent only when divorce or separation, or to some extent death, lay bare its skeleton to public view and make clear that it is a contract not only about the sexual fidelity, cohabitation, and mutual support mentioned in the wedding ceremony, but also sexual availability at will, housework, financial support, even after marriage breakdown, a relation between the citizen head of household and the secondary dependent, and so on to indeterminate terms. We need not be in principle opposed to social control and concern in private household arrangement to believe that marriage is the wrong form for this. Marriage is a form that is sanctified by tradition, not justified by rational social debate. The tradition is one that carries with it the whole historical baggage of male power and patriarchal authority. One has only to think of the traditional wedding ceremony, with its symbolic giving away of the bride by her father to her husband, the white wedding dress symbolizing her claim to virginity, or the cream one admitting that she cannot make this claim, though it will not show up in the photographic record, the striking contrast between men's and women's clothing in the wedding party. But most important, marriage is a form that conflates the sexual with the economic. As Engels so crisply pointed out, monogamous marriage and prostitution were born in the same moment. Marriage perhaps represents a contradiction in the conservative confusion of individualism with familism. For if marriage is the basis of the family, then this supposedly individual and freely chosen form has a state instrument at its heart. Those who defend marriage as what people want and need must explain then why it has to be so massively privileged by social policy, taxation, religious endorsement, and the accolade of respectability. 3. Privacy as imprisonment. The exclusion of outsiders and turning into the little family group may seem attractive when it works well and when the family does satisfy its members' needs. But the little enclosed group can also be a trap, a prison whose walls and bars are constructed of the ideas of domestic privacy and autonomy. Why is it that when a man is brutally assaulting his wife, the police and neighbors, all of us, are so reluctant to intervene? It is thought of as interfering in a private matter. The bond between them is seen as so special that outsiders should not presume to take a stand, even when it is quite clear that what is happening is an extreme form of physical violence. Why is it that the woman in this situation is so reluctant to go to others for help or protection? She often accepts that violence is a normal risk of marriage, or that she has failed in some way by inviting violence or not managing to stave it off. The privacy of the family is cast in a new light if we realize that 1/4 of reported violent crime is wife assault, and that a very large proportion of rapes are carried out by men who know their victims well, often husbands, boyfriends, fathers, and uncles. If these are reported cases of violence and rape, we can safely assume that there is a huge penumbra of unreported incidents. It is ironical that the very expectations of security and protection in the private family are what make women so vulnerable to victimization within it, and so deprived of any resource or plausible appeal to anyone outside its walls. Women often avoid going out alone at night for fear of being followed or attacked. Thus they become more ensnared in a home that may itself become a place of danger for them. The recent public interest in domestic violence, spurred on by feminists, has produced a small increase in official willingness to intervene and also improved the legal procedures enabling a woman to obtain an injunction to exclude a violent man from the home. But it is apparent that for most women in such situations, there is no solution other than actually leaving and breaking up the home. For a woman with children, this is difficult to accomplish and even to contemplate. The existence now of a network of refuges for battered women, and the fact that local authorities are now obliged to provide accommodation for women with children who have left their home because of domestic violence can help women with some of the most pressing practical problems. The difficulty of finding alternative housing is one of the solid walls of the little family prison, but other less tangible walls will keep many women from escaping. Violence and rape, it may be thought, are not the everyday experience of family life for most people. This is probably true, though they are much commoner than roseate social images allow. But they do show up in a stark way how vulnerable people can be within the family, and they show how women are trapped much more than men. It is true that men sometimes experience the family as a mental prison, but they usually have far more opportunities for steering clear of the house if they want to. It is true that children can be beaten and psychologically confined and mistreated, but they too usually have an escape and another life of school and peers outside the home. It is women whose work and emotional satisfaction is expected to center around home and family who are most fully imprisoned there. The daily regime in the prison is not the drama of violence or rape, it is the long hours of working banged up in a solitary cell while the guards attend to other, more important business. It is the mundane stuff of cartoons. It is 5:45 p.m. in a block of council flats. In each of 50 boxes a woman is frying the children's fish fingers, bathing the baby, putting the dirty clothes into the washing machine, and peeling the potatoes for the husband's tea. All the same, but all in isolation. Even if she goes out to work, a woman must spend many hours on housework, and it is many hours of socially unrewarding work because it is not shared, unrelieved by companionship. It is not the character of the household tasks themselves that is oppressive, but the solitary, continuing, and unrelieved nature of the multiplicity of household responsibilities. Many women will push their toddlers miles to a once a week playgroup just in order to have an hour alone without the child's constant questions and demands. The most common complaint of those who have to care for the senile or the severely disabled is that they never have any time off. Add to this the fact that the workplace is also the home, so that there is no separate leisure that is not intruded upon by the evidence of uncompleted tasks, and the experience of enclosure is total. Of course, most women also work outside the home for much of their lives, and others do manage to form bonds and interests outside it. But even so, they are usually more enmeshed in the family than men and are far more likely to be the ones who take the domestic responsibilities. It is they rather than men who give up their jobs while children are babies or when old people need to be cared for. There are two striking, though crude, statistical facts that demand explanation. One is that far more men than women are convicted of criminal offenses. Another is that more women than men are treated for depressive and neurotic mental illnesses. Though the processes involved are far from clear, it is hard to resist the conclusion that these correlations are in some way rooted in men's and women's different relation to private and public life. Men are more fully located in the public sphere and more fully challenge and fall foul of its formal techniques of social control. Women, on the other hand, are subjected to the coercion of privacy and are protected to some extent from the rigors of the criminal law. The processes of the behaviors and experiences of mental illness and of its diagnosis and treatment are much more complex than the criminal processes. It would be simplistic to describe them as social control, which implies that the behaviors labeled as mentally ill are free expressions of individual variety, and the psychiatric procedures merely techniques for curbing and reducing to conformity. It would be simplistic also to see becoming mentally ill just as a measure of suffering. Yet we do need to explain why women who work outside the home and unmarried women are less likely to become depressed than the housebound wife. It is clear that being a housewife can drive women mad, though why they tend so often to experience depression and nerves rather than, say, anger or revolt is perhaps less clear. 4. Women's work. After a decade of modern feminism, it is a commonplace to see women's association with the housekeeping and childcare one of the keys to their oppression. The role differentiation beloved of sociologists of the 1950s is nothing other than a very unequal division of labor. With the role of wife and mother goes housework. It is hard and exacting work. An Oakley study of housewives with young children showed that they worked an average of 77 hours per week, including shopping and childcare, but not including time spent relaxing in the house. The hours they worked ranged from 48, this woman had a full-time paid job as well, to 105 per week. Labor-saving equipment and ready-prepared food and clothing are not bringing about a reduction in these hours. They seem just to raise the standards of what must be done. With a freezer and a microwave oven, there's no excuse for a quick fry-up when you get home from work. On the whole, women define housework as real work, and they do not enjoy it, or at best feel ambivalent about it. The major sources of dissatisfaction, Anne Oakley found, were that the work is monotonous, repetitive, and fragmented. It is made up of many different tasks, and although caring for children and cooking are fairly satisfying, many of the other tasks are not. Keeping a house clean and caring for children seem to contradict each other. Housewives work long hours at a pressurized pace. The work is done in lonely isolation from other adults. Housework has low status, and even the families for whom it is done seem unappreciative, though they complain if the house is uncomfortable, their clothes not clean, their meals not ready, or if the woman has not time to give them her attention. The tasks are oppressive enough in themselves, especially when they must be performed in the isolated family. But most oppressive is the apparent inevitability with which women are destined to this vocation whether or not they have a paid job, and even whether or not they marry or have children. Women's consignment to housework does not even depend on marriage and financial support. Many old and disabled people have a female relative, a daughter, a niece, a mother, to keep house for them and look after them. The social services department is reluctant to take much responsibility if there is a woman they can foist it on. In myriad ways, the policies of the state services and of state income maintenance provisions assume and insist that women are destined to housework and to caring for those in need. Underlying this is the assumption that to keep house is a natural adjunct of femininity. Wielding a needle or a mop, changing a nappy or a bed, not running out of flour or into debt, come easily to women, it seems. We are blamed if we cannot manage them, whereas men are praised if they can. Girls are thought unnatural if they do not want to learn these skills as children. Boys are thought unusual, if not unnatural, if they do. The natural association of women with housework is thought to be rooted in motherhood. The biological facts of childbearing and lactation lead with an inevitability so obvious that it does not need to be spelled out to primary responsibility for childcare, to a close, intimate, warm bond between mother and infant, which extends naturally to buying and preparing its food, washing its clothes, binding its wound, helping with its homework, taking it to the dentist, discussing its teenage problems, welcoming its husband or wife, grandmothering its children. Enough has been written about the myth of motherhood to convince us that the reason those obvious and natural links do not need to be spelled out is that they would come apart if examined too closely. The problem for women is not so much the tyranny of reproduction that Shulamit Firestone wished to overthrow, that can be tamed if we can control the technology. The problem is rather the tyranny of motherhood. This may sound an extraordinary thing to say when many women clearly wish and choose to become mothers. What they can seldom choose, though, are the social circumstances and pressures that would enable them to resist being swamped by motherhood. There's often such a tension between being a mother and being whatever else you want to be that neither can be fully enjoyed. Sometimes women who would really like to have children decide not to because they cannot work out a social situation in which they can do so without giving up everything else. Many women do give up their paid work and other projects. Usually they find their relationship with their children deeply rewarding, but at the same time they feel frustrated that it has become such an exclusive and demanding one. All too often, in the context of the isolated private family and with little outside support, motherhood becomes a burden in itself and also a major means by which women become trapped in the home. Even couples who at first share the cooking and cleaning equally seldom do so after the children arrive. The woman stays at home to care for the small baby, so obviously she takes care of the running of the house at the same time. Later, if she returns to outside work, she does a double shift. The man has to earn enough to support the whole family, so obviously he has not much time or energy left for domestic matters. Gradually, the knots linking the woman to the home and family become tightened. If she's lucky, she may find it rewarding. If she does not, she is unlucky. Most likely, though, she feels deeply ambivalent about it because it is her love for her children that ties her down. This is what we mean by the tyranny of motherhood. Men, on the other hand, can usually choose how and how much they get involved with their children. They are expected to take some part, but also to be the outside authority and final arbiter. Many of them play with their children a good deal in their spare time, but seldom do they carry the regular responsibility of physical and emotional care. It is often said that men do a great deal about the house as well. They put up shelves and repair things that go wrong. They see to the car, which thereby becomes their car if it was not already. They look after the bank account and the mortgage. But all the chores that men do can be done by women and often are, whereas there are many elements of housework that a man will seldom do if there is a woman around to do them. Often these are the tasks that are considered undignified. Surveys in which men and women are asked about what tasks they perform in and around the home typically show that men claim to do more things than women say they do. In general, men's jobs have more of a voluntary character. Do it yourself work is often even seen as a hobby. It can be done as and when the man chooses. His contributions to the routine chores that go to make up housework are often seen as helping his wife. The work properly belongs to her, but he will help her out if he has time and if he wants to. For her, the tasks are seen as inescapable, for him they are not. Women's commitment to housework is not imposed on them by their own menfolk in a straightforward way. Indeed, many men would not notice whether the house was clean and tidy or not, provided their meals were ready on time and their clothes washed for them. One of the great problems of the politics of housework is the question of standards. The chief immediate reason that women do most of it is that they are brought up to be more attuned to cleanliness and more anxious about dirt and mess. Researchers who have interviewed housewives have been struck by two things above all. One was how dissatisfied they were with their lot. The other was their obsessive approach to their work. Lee Comer commented that for the housewives she talked to, almost everyone felt obliged to apologize for the state their homes were in, even when they were immaculate. She suggests that they often submit to real or imagined external moral pressure from other women because this is the only way of giving housework any rationality. Since the housewife's work is in fact so private, quote, if she insists on satisfying only her own requirements in a wholly utilitarian way, she risks being labeled self-indulgent and immoral, unquote. Women's exaggeratedly high standards for housework are not just a product of their own life situation. They are also passed on from one generation to another. Historically, they were created and reinforced by schools, domestic science propaganda, and social workers. Today, they are stimulated by the media, especially in advertising. The endless proliferation of separate little households has been an ideal ally in the constant capitalist effort to expand consumption and keep up the demand for ever more commodities. The woman, as the moving spirit of each household, needs to be deeply concerned with its physical state, its equipment, its style. She is acutely aware of how it compares with other households in her milieu. Her aim is that it should replicate them while being slightly better in some respects. If she can accomplish this, she serves not only the economic needs of capital, but also helps to produce an apparently uniform population which seems more divided by competition, envy, and lifestyle than by the struggle of classes. Any struggle to end the division of labor in the family, to get men to share in the routine household cares, involves converting men from idle parasitism and presumed incapacity. But it also involves breaking out of the dead end of the "it's easier to do it myself" mentality. This mentality, premised as it is on the acceptance that it is women's work and women know how best it should be done, even when done by men, invites passive resistance and even dumb insolence from the men who have never been permitted to establish the goals or agree the means for this new shared activity. Yet this mentality is not arbitrary. It cannot be abandoned by a mere effort of will. For one thing, it is genuinely true that housework, cooking, and childcare are complex activities in which most women have been fully and thoroughly trained over a lifetime. Though their attitude may be sometimes obsessional, the rules that they apply are usually rational and well founded in experience. Furthermore, women's emotional investment in housework is a product of a situation in which marriage, family, and homemaking are usually the most promising career available. For most young women, the cards are heavily stacked in favor of becoming a wife. As they say, it's easy for a woman to get the same pay as a man. All she has to do is marry one. The apparently indissoluble link between femininity and keeping house and looking after people is thus rooted in the family, but extends well beyond its confines. To challenge the division of labor in the family would be to challenge an oppressive feature of the femininity that is so limiting to women. 5. Petty power and social power. The division of labor in the family is associated with the greater power of men. Despite the contemporary rhetoric of the egalitarian family and the sharing marriage, despite the disappearance of the more obvious formalized manifestations of paternal power and manly authority, modern families are still deeply unequal affairs. The principle of the wage earner and his dependents, of the husband who contributes cash while the wife contributes household labor, is not a division of labor between equals, but an unequal exchange in which the man's interests predominate. Even if we ignore for the moment the more intangible things like authority, self esteem, deference, and submission, and look only at the almost measurable distribution of goods and services in the household, it is clear that 1. The man's benefit from the housework that women do is far more than equivalent to the support that he gives her. 2. Such support is very variable, and its extent is conditional upon goodwill. And 3. Decisions about shared consumption often work in favor of the things that men want. 1. If the cash value of a wife's multifarious services on the open market were computed, it would far exceed what a husband could afford to pay. A recent survey found that the average housewife is fully employed for 7 days a week, though Sunday is a fairly light day with only 6.5 hours work. If she were paid at the going rate for each of her various activities, from cost clerk through waitress, laundress, and childminder to cleaner, her salary would be £204 a week, or £10,600 a year. Even a comparison of the hours and conditions of work of wives with those of living in general servants, whom most men could not begin to afford, shows that men are getting an extremely good bargain out of the support they offer. But even if men who supported their wives entirely could be said to pay fairly for the benefits they received, this could hardly be said in the much commoner cases where the wife also earns some money and contributes it towards household expenses. If she earns a wage that is half of her husband's, she raises their total joint income and also relieves him of half of what he previously paid for her support. Yet the amount of housework that she does is not reduced by anything like as much as half. Household services are very different from commodities, and the terms on which men obtain their wives' services are very different from those of the marketplace. The question of exchange is seldom an overt one. Men may pay their children to clean their car or run an errand, but they do not pay their wives to clean the living room or make them a cup of tea. Households formed on the basis of kinship are the only setting in which such free domestic services are available, provided on the basis of the love and duty associated with kinship and marriage. It seems almost sacrilegious to intrude economic calculation into the bosom of the family, conducted as it is on affectional and not economic principles. Yet if, when we do so, our calculations reveal gross inequities, we can see that, like many sacred mysteries, the mystic bonds of family serve to mask mundane exploitation. 2. Do men really share their incomes as the ideal model of marriage would suggest? A growing amount of evidence shows that they seldom do, and that there is little their wives can do about it. The ways in which families organize their internal financial arrangements are so varied that it is hard to state any general rules about them, but the very fact of this variety might suggest that husbands have a good deal of say in deciding just how much they will share. An arrangement that used to be very widespread among working class people in Britain and is still quite common in Scotland and the north of England, especially where the wife has no income and the husband's income is low, is the one known as tipping up. Under this system, the husband and formerly any working sons and daughters living at home hands over his whole wage packet to the wife and gets given his pocket money, normally a fixed amount. This is often held up as evidence of a sound working class tradition of sharing, yet in fact it ensures that the wage earner gets money for purely personal spending, while the housewife gets only what is needed for the common household expenses. The other well-known and apparently very widespread system is where the wife is given a housekeeping allowance, a standard weekly amount to cover all the household expenditure. The rest of his income is the man's to spend as he wishes, while she must either save out of the housekeeping or ask him for money for anything she wants for herself. This system seems calculated to maximize bad feeling and resentment. A man with a variable pay packet may find his pocket money much reduced in some weeks. The woman finds that the amount she is allowed does not go up with rising prices. She often may not know how much her husband earns, and there's evidence that increases in his pay are often not reflected in increased housekeeping money. Men whose wages are paid into the bank instead of in cash often take over responsibility for some of the household expenditure, paying the larger bills for rent or mortgage payments, and often gas and electricity. The housekeeping allowance then only has to cover smaller cash outlays. Indeed, supermarkets have made possible an arrangement where the weekly shopping is done by the couple together and paid for by the man with his checkbook. In extreme cases, he need give his wife no cash at all. The worst aspect of these ways of managing money is that they fuse the interests of women with those of the family. Children have pocket money, men have pocket money, or else the residue of their wage, but women have only the money destined for housekeeping. Everything she spends on herself is taken out of what could have gone on food or on clothes for the children. In fact, until 1964, anything she saved out of the housekeeping allowance legally belonged to the husband. Now it belongs to both equally, though most people are not aware of this. And whatever the law may say, there's something very ambiguous about such savings, given the ideology that Anne Whitehead has called maternal altruism, in which the mother always puts the family or the children first and gets her satisfaction from spending on them and not on herself. Expenditure on herself is supposed to induce guilt. She buys a new dress to cheer herself up, whereas a working man needs his fares and his cigarette and drink money to help him through the working day. 3. A complete pooling of resources is clearly the most progressive and egalitarian arrangement. Wages or salaries are paid into a joint bank account or put into a joint purse from which all expenditures, whether common or personal, are made. Of the housewives she interviewed for The Captive Wife, Hannah Gavran found that 56% of wives of middle class men and 77% of wives of working class men had only a regular allowance to manage on. So sharing seems to be a more frequent pattern among white collar workers, though interestingly it is followed more where both partners are earning rather than only the man. Yet, in this apparently equal situation, everything depends upon how spending decisions are made. In practice, the decision making power lies with the one who brings in the sole or major income. In any marriage relationship, practical and emotional considerations are all mixed up together, but the outcome is usually clear. The fact that the husband actually earns his money is important, even where couples pool their resources. Where they do not, it is common for the husband's earning to cover things that are thought of as necessary expenditures, such as rent, heating, normal food buying, and regular outgoings which cannot readily be reduced, while the wife's are spent on things thought of as extras. This practice may be rational in the sense that the couple need to be sure that they could manage on the husband's income since the wife is much more insecure, but it also has the effect of reinforcing the idea of the breadwinner and dependent even when the wife is not fully dependent. In fact, of course, the pin money is not for personal fripperies but goes towards maintaining the family standard of living. Many families would fall below the poverty line without the wife's earnings. Goodwill and a progressive outlook are not enough to work away the power differential that comes from the fact of women's dependence. In a society where supporting yourself is equated with earning an income, contributing to the household on an unpaid basis can never give the woman the same rights as the man. Furthermore, unless he has the goodwill and the progressive outlook, she will be completely at his mercy. We do not wish to suggest that the man's domination in the family is simply a product of the economic imbalance in the particular case. If this were so, the strategy for correcting it could rely entirely on getting women out into employment on an equal basis with men. This was the view of Engels, who argued that the entry of women into industrial production would eliminate the economic inequality between working class women and men, and so abolish the basis for the subordination of women. History since his day has proved that men have been able to establish a sexual division of labor in industrial production and between industry and family, and so to prevent the very fact of capitalist industrial employment from becoming the great leveler that Engels anticipated. Men have successfully fought for the rather more privileged job situations, leaving the insecure and low paid work to women and immigrant workers. Even when women do go out to full time jobs, their pay is on average only a percentage of men's. But men have also allowed full time work to become so defined that it is hard to combine with any household responsibilities. The hours and conditions of employment are usually such that the worker has no right to time off for shopping, to care for a sick child, to stay in for the washing machine repair, or any of the 101 exigencies of domestic life. So the petty power that men wield in the family is backed up by their power in the wider social world. The experience of many women has also proved that even when two partners in a marriage bring in similar incomes, the man retains his domination in all sorts of non economic ways. The structures of domination and submission go far beyond the material facts of providing and dependence, into the unconscious, into sexuality, into all the rituals of love, coziness, deference, cajoling, leadership that go to make up the daily interactions between wives and husbands. The practice of consciousness raising in the women's liberation movement has uncovered many subtle, taken for granted ways in which men dominate and women submit. Some of the most disturbing of these are the forms of collusion in our own oppression that we all adopt. Women's guilt, lack of self confidence, willingness to get something by charm if they can't get it as of right, all play into the hands of men's power. 6. Sexual liberation. The unequal power in marriage lies at the root of an imbalance between men's and women's sexuality that is becoming more and more contested. Heterosexual relations between the adults, modeled on the procreative act, are privileged above all other forms of sexual expression. Monogamy is morally endorsed. Science and folklore concur in the belief that men have positive and often aggressive sexual drives, which are often promiscuous rather than directed towards one mate, while women's sexual interests are weaker and more diffuse, part of the emotional expression of a deeper relationship and responsive to the man's desires rather than self generating. It is even believed that women's sexuality is more closely bound up with the conception and motherhood, though there is no biological basis for this belief. On the contrary, women's sexual pleasure has no procreative function, whereas the man's orgasm in intercourse is necessary to conception. Feminists have always recognized the gross asymmetry of the double standard of morality, which condones male philandering while enjoining chastity for women as a form of male privilege. It degrades women by encouraging prostitution. It makes other women forever the objects of male advances that they must forever repel. In the 19th century, feminists most often saw sex as a primitive urge that all civilized people should strive to control. It wasted energy and health, spread venereal disease, and brought unwanted children, as well as degrading women. So they celebrated rather than deplored the asexual idea of womanhood. The solution, that men should curb their bestial impulses, had its most succinct if extreme expression in Christabel Pankhurst's slogan, "Votes for women and chastity for men." In early socialist thought in England, there had been another tradition, fed by the streams of Robert Owen's utopianism and the historical materialism of Marx and Engels. Both saw the existing forms of sexuality as a product of social arrangements. Marx wrote that the sexual relation of men and women reveals the extent to which man's natural behavior has become human, the extent to which he in his individual existence is at the same time a social being. Unquote. Utopianism contributed a lively critique of the constraints of monogamy, especially in its inegalitarian forms, and a shining vision of a socialism in which people's lives would be guided by self-determination rather than the externally imposed laws of church and state. Historical materialism contributed the belief that each historic era has its own way of life and form of family. Engels argued that private property was associated with male dominance, monogamy, and the indissolubility of marriage. Monogamy he saw as desirable, provided it was cut free of its economic mooring, but he expected socialism to bring the equality of the sexes and the freedom to leave a dead union and form another one. Though some socialists played a part in the sex reform movement in the early years of this century and in the movement for birth control, sexual libertarianism has not been a dominant strand in English socialist thought. Indeed, George Ives commented in 1904 that there is a curious kind of socialism in this country which is allied with Christianity and even with Grundism that, to my mind, is more hateful than the present order. The socialism to which I belong, and to which solid millions adhere on the continent, refuses all compromises with the religious parties, all compromises with existing sexual morality, all compromises with the class system in any shape. Unquote. For the most part, the politics of sexuality has remained outside the mainstream, marginalized by a general consensus that questions of sex are concerned with morality and private life and not with the big issues of power and economics. It is this consensus that the new women's liberation movement has sought to destroy with the slogan, "The personal is political," and a nagging insistence on raising questions about violence, sex, abortion, contraception on what were previously the most inappropriate occasions, like trade union meetings and May Day celebrations. But although the women's liberation movement is united on the importance of these questions, there is much less certainty about where the answers lie. Some favor an all out attack on pornography, more effective punishment of sexual molesters and rapists, and even women's withdrawal from all heterosexual relations. Others, including ourselves, believe that no solution to our sexual malaise is possible without a more fundamental transformation in the power relation between women and men. On the other hand, we are more optimistic than many about the possibilities of ameliorating human nature, even including the sexual nature of men. The sex reform movement of this century has brought enormous benefits. Few people are as ignorant about sex as they were in the 19th century. Knowledge of birth control and of venereal diseases makes sex more enjoyable. The challenging of taboos means that people feel less guilty about masturbation and about homosexuality. Women's sexual pleasure is better understood and is seen as a good thing. Many even believe that all the restrictions and hang-ups of Victorian sexuality have been swept away in the tide of permissiveness, and that sex is now frank and free and truly mutual. Yet, how fundamental a change has there really been? A gross asymmetry in heterosexual relations remains, despite these improvements. Men still seek and are willing to pay for the services of prostitutes, often asking for the fulfillment of the most bizarre fantasies and fetishes. They pour huge sums of money into the burgeoning trade of pornographic magazines, pictures, films, and videotapes, which represent women as the objects of male desires. Clubs, pubs, and conferences of businessmen and union men are routinely entertained with girly strip shows. Men still rape women. Fathers still commit incest with their daughters. It is practically never the other way around. This asymmetry in sex is still as great as it ever was, much greater than in many supposedly primitive societies. Women are no longer expected to be chaste, but sex is still on men's terms. It is almost as if women's obvious sexual enjoyment were just another thing that men can demand of them. A far cry from the feminist dream of autonomy, from being a sexual agent rather than a sexual object, it turns out that a liberated lady is more fun in bed for the man. The weakening of the rigid rules has only added to the anxieties of growing up for girls. They still see a social danger in being too much available to boys sexually. They still fear that being too little available will mean they are ignored by boys. The polarity between the slack and the drag, between the girl who sleeps around and the nice girl who doesn't, has a long history. In the 19th century, it was the virgin and the whore, the Madonna and the Magdalene, the respectable woman and the fallen woman. At the same time, even among the respectable, girls had to be wary of flirting or being fast. The boundary has shifted a good deal since then. In most circles, girls can sleep with one boyfriend if it is a steady relationship and they are in love. The stakes have risen, but the game has basically the same rules. Men pressurize women into going too far and then despise them for it. Women's main concern must always be not with what they want themselves, but with how to strike just the right balance in attracting or repelling men. This sexual asymmetry is social rather than natural in its origins. It is part of the pattern of courtship and of marriage. In the long testing time of youth, boys can afford to seek sexual enjoyment. They are expected to prove themselves as men. They may also be looking for someone to marry, someone who will settle with them, take care of their house and children. Chasing girls is both a search for pleasure and a way of testing girls out, sorting them into those who are all right for a good time and those who are more serious. For a girl, the need to marry is more serious. It is often the chief thing she looks forward to in the future. It will alter her whole life much more than it will her husband's life. Realistically, her chances of earning good money are lower, and marriage and dependence on a husband to supplement her income offer a better standard of living and more security than she could expect if she was single. So, early in life, the girl feels she must regulate her sexual behavior to serve this goal. The danger of being labeled a slag is the danger of not being taken seriously as a possible partner. She cannot afford to explore her own sexuality or develop her own desires for fear of losing her reputation and self esteem, for her activity is always reinterpreted as receptivity. Her sexual achievements are not conquests but defeats. She is anybody's, an easy lay, the object of the man's desire. Her job is to defend herself, to ration her favors. She learns to parry advances, to tease, to feint, to gain a modicum of control in a situation where she is basically disadvantaged. The fact that this whole pattern, degrading to all concerned, has survived intact through the great upheavals of the permissive age suggests that it is more than a mere relic of an outdated Victorian code. Deep-seated differences between the sexes do tend to be reproduced from generation to generation by the fact that children are reared by a pair of differentiated parents and the parameters of their sexual orientation are set in the context of their early relations with those parents. But our unbalanced pattern of sexuality is also an integral part of a thriving marriage system that still enshrines male power and female dependence. Until that form of family disappears, sexual enjoyment will continue to be a male privilege and it will continue to take the form of sexual possession. Clearly, then, it remains necessary, as the early socialists recognized, to separate sex love from these economic ties and allow it to flourish in its own right. Defenders of the family commonly argue that we have only to look around us to see that sex outside of marriage is less satisfactory than sex within it. It is certainly true that prostitution, pornography, and sexualization of the mass media, many facets of the male gay scene, and, as we have seen, the premarital sex of teenage years, all reflect a predatory, dehumanized male sexuality. Yet they are so unpleasant because they are forbidden, rather than forbidden because they are unpleasant. Men who would not be willing to pay prostitutes if it were not the fact that their heterosexual desires have been indulged and accorded legitimacy, and women's constructed as weak and receptive in the interest of a male dominated marriage system. The same applies to pornography and the mass media. Homosexual life would not be so distinct and ghettoized if heterosexual marriage were not both inordinately privileged by social mores and also stressful and unattractive, so that many are willing to risk ridicule and ostracism rather than follow the conventional patterns. In milder forms, the polarity of active and passive, with its echoes of hunter and hunted, possessor and possessed, permeates almost all sexual relations, whether between women, between men, or between women and men. No sexual relation can be entirely free from the pervasive imagery based on marriage. Yet it is also true that within marriage, and within other long term pairs, it is sometimes possible to develop relations of sexual reciprocity and caring. But it would be wrong to conclude from this that the solution to modern sexual problems is to strengthen marriage and the family and try to confine sex to the domestic setting, for it is precisely the oppressive and unbalanced nature of the family that creates the kind of sexuality that exists outside it. Confining sex within marriage is not the answer to the problem. At the social level, it is itself the cause of the problem. 7. Family gains and social losses. What happens outside families is much affected by the existence of the family as a privileged institution. Every other aspect of social life is planned on the assumption that people live in families. Those who do not are isolated and deprived. Spinsters, old bachelors, and couples who do not have children are frowned upon. People who live by themselves are thought to be abnormal. The popular image of the family, the married couple living with their young children, is constantly projected as the image of normality and of happiness. Yet, in fact, half of the population do not live in this situation. Even those who do get married and have children themselves spend only the first 16 or so years of their lives and, say, 20 years of adulthood living in a family with children. The bulk of their lives is spent living just with adults or on their own. In Britain in 1979, 23% of households had only one person, 27% had a married couple on their own, and only 31% had a married couple living with their dependent children. Yet the family ideal makes everything else seem pale and unsatisfactory. Those who live alone often suffer from loneliness. Families are so wrapped up in their little domestic life that they have not time to spend on visiting. Their social life is with people like themselves. Couples mix with other couples, finding it difficult to fit single people in. The middle class custom of balancing the sexes at dinner parties is only a formalized version of the endemic exclusion of the single, divorced, and widowed. The estrangement of the sexes outside of specifically sexual relationships persists at all ages and increases isolation even among the elderly. The cozy image of the family makes all other settings where people can mix and live together seem like second best. Nurseries, children's homes, student residences, nursing homes, old people's homes, all in their different ways conjure up pictures of bleakness, deprivation, acceptable perhaps for daycare or for part of the year or a brief stage in life, but very much a pis aller to be resorted to only if normal family life cannot be provided. Hospital social workers expect a daughter, mother, or wife to look after a discharged patient in preference to a convalescent home. Nurses are trained in the theories of John Bowlby and taught to believe a small child is better off spending all day with its mother. Old people's homes are only for those who can no longer care for themselves, and they are expected to give up most of their autonomy on entering. The old poor law principle of less eligibility, whereby relief was only provided under conditions considerably less attractive than self support, seems to have been translated into a new sphere. Living outside the family is possible, but only under conditions considerably less attractive than those within it. Yet it need not be so. Old people's homes could be a lot more like residential hotels, or else like self governing communities. A home for the handicapped can be considerably more stimulating for a teenager with Down syndrome than living alone with her parents. A nursery or children's home can provide positive social experiences of cooperation, companionship, and varied activities. It is the overvaluation of family life that devalues these other lives. The family sucks the juice out of everything around it, leaving other institutions stunted and distorted. Production and all paid work is organized to dovetail with a particular kind of family, one in which the wife is responsible for housekeeping and caring for the family members, and can be dependent on the husband's income if need be. Any housewife or parent who has had an ordinary full time job finds that work is planned at places and times that are incompatible with domestic responsibilities. The hours of work, the distance from shops, the problems of taking time off are all well enough suited to a man who has a wife at home taking care of the house and children, the shopping and cooking, staying in for the gas meter reader, going out to the school sports day, So it is not surprising that so many women have part time jobs when they do go out to work. Nor is it surprising that there are probably approaching 500,000 women who work for money at home, doing machining, assembling, clerical work, and child minding. Because of their home responsibilities, many women have a rather marginal relation to the labor market. On the other hand, almost all women are disadvantaged in the labor market from the word go, and it is partly this that makes marriage an attractive option for them. If your chances of earning a good income are small, and women's average weekly earnings for full time work are only 63% of men's, dependence on a man, even if it involves household cares that further reduce your ability to earn, may seem a wise choice. At first sight, then, there appears to be a neat fit between women's place in the labor market and their place at home. Their part time or less permanent involvement in pay work frees them to run the home. Men's full time work enables them to earn a family wage to support a dependent wife and children. Many would say that women are not disadvantaged in earning a living, but are able to earn in a way appropriate to their family position. Quote, "It is normal for a married woman in this country to be primarily supported by her husband, and she looks to him for support when not actually working," unquote, was the way a minister in the Department of Health and Social Security put it. Yet when we realize that this supposedly normal pattern of dependence is in fact a myth, it becomes clear that the supposedly appropriate pattern of women having less training, fewer job opportunities, and lower pay is nothing less than a con trick made possible by the power of the family myth. The trick is given another bitter twist when it is argued that since women now have equal rights at work, their husbands no longer has the responsibility to maintain them. Such is the argument offered by the Campaign for Justice in Divorce in favor of abolishing the husband's obligation to maintain his wife after divorce. So there is constructed a curious house of cards in which the myth and the reality of the family alternately provide support for ever more ramshackle and unsatisfactory excrescences, each of which in turn serves to shore up the myth and keep the reality more or less intact. The world around the family is not a pre existing harsh climate against which the family offers protection and warmth. It is as if the family had drawn comfort and security into itself and left the outside world bereft. As a bastion against a bleak society, it has made that society bleak. It is indeed a major agency for caring, but in monopolizing care, it has made it harder to undertake other forms of care. It is indeed a unit of sharing, but in demanding sharing within, it has made other relations tend to become more mercenary. It is indeed a place of intimacy, but in privileging the intimacy of close kin, it has made the outside world cold and friendless, and made it harder to sustain relations of security and trust except with kin. Caring, sharing, and loving would be more widespread if the family did not claim them for its own.